Welcome to Ray's Talk Show, the podcast that won't be silenced. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us. You can check out Ray's Talk Show anywhere you can download a podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube. The list goes on. And catch us on social media, on IG at Ray's Latino Talk, and on Twitter at Ray's RAYS Podcast. Continue the conversation. We go 24/7, 365 here on Ray's Talk Show. The theme of this week's episode is what's next for progressives? What lessons should progressives learn from the 2018 electoral cycle? What should progressives focus on? Issue organizing, electoral mobilization, trying to get Trump impeached, base building, leadership development? Lots of ways we could go here. How is the AOC effect impacting all of this? To delve into these questions, we will hear today from progressive activists Dwight Bullard, Natalia Salgado, and Vanessa Maria Graber. The future of the progressive movement, plus my thoughts on the latest turns in the Trump legal novella, and of course, the 2020 presidential watch on this edition of Ray's Talk Show. Today's interviews were first aired on WPPM 106.5 Community Radio in Philadelphia. Support WPPM and let us know what you think of the new show, the new format, maybe the new name. Vamos a ver. Let us know how we're doing out there and support WPPM and, of course, the podcast. Before we hear this week's interviews, I did want to share a thought about the recent public spat between congressional Democratic leaders and President Trump. Now, most analysis is focused on leader Pelosi's clapback and Trump's clowning. And that's all real, and that all happened. But I really want to know what the real story is here. The Democrats embarrassed him and boxed him into accepting blame for the potential government shutdown on border wall funding. But listen, the Democrats ultimately, in a true moment of leadership, fell short. They didn't tell the American public in this moment when they had all eyes on them the truth of this whole situation. Because at the end of the day, regardless of how they embarrassed him, they still engaged him in this debate, this nonsensical debate around, some would argue, overzealous militarization of our border and border security efforts. They should have questioned the whole premise of the conversation. Border enforcement, for real, is like the 78th most important issue we're dealing with in this country right now, if you want to know the truth. Really look at the whole picture. It wouldn't make the field of 64 NCAA tournament of federal political issues we're dealing with. It's not even the biggest immigration issue, policy issue we're dealing with. We have 14,000 children. Let me repeat that number again to y'all, my people. 14,000 children that are currently being detained by immigration officials. These children don't know where their parents are. These children don't know if they're ever going to see their parents again. These children are being held under very questionable circumstances. I mean, there's facilities don't even have background checks for their employees. These children are being educated formally. These children are experiencing tremendous psychological damage. We don't know what's happening in these facilities. That humanitarian crisis is the immigration issue we should be focusing on. So yes, Pelosi killed it. Trump's a clown, buffoon. But the true moment of leadership should have been Pelosi and Schumer telling all of us the truth of the entire situation. Trump has made up this crisis to scare white people by demonizing and dehumanizing people of color. And it has to stop now. And by engaging in the conversation on some level, the Democratic leadership fed into that conversation and that dehumanization in a way. Children are being imprisoned, hate crimes on the rise, and guess what? None of that is getting any more middle-aged white people in the Midwest jobs, and certainly is not making our country great. Let's now talk about what's next for the progressive movement on Ray's Talk Show. On our special series that's being aired on WPPM 106.5 People Powered Radio in Philadelphia. And I'll be back in a moment to talk about the latest in the Trump legal novella. Welcome to What's Next, the special series on WPPM Radio, where we explore what's next for Philadelphia and our country as we enter 2019. We will talk to activist organizers, political leaders, and creatives on how we empower ourselves to advocate for the community we deserve. As Natalia Mejia said on last week's show, we like nice things too. This is your host, Ray Collazo, a family man, organizer, and member of the Trust the Process Nation, for you Hoops fans, who's the host of Ray's Talk Show's podcast. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share these conversations with you now on WPPM 106.5 Community Radio. I am so honored to be joined by the queen of the mothership here at WPPM Radio and Philly Cam Nation, Vanessa Maria Graber. Vanessa, welcome to What's Next.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, no, Vanessa, thank you so much. And we have on the line, before we introduce two very special guests on this episode, I wanted to touch on what's the theme of today. So What's Next is really a series related to sort of what's next for us in 2019 in politics and organizing, and even in pop culture, as we'll get into a little bit in this conversation. But we really want to talk about today what's next specifically for the progressive movement. How do progressives organize in 2019? How much do we push our Democratic friends in the state legislatures and the federal government, and even potential presidential candidates? That and the Wakanda effect, and even more on Ray's Talk Show on What's Next here on WPPM. To kick off this conversation, we have on the line the political director of Florida New Majority, Dwight Bullard. Dwight, welcome to What's Next on WPPM.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
And if you hear that little twang in his voice, got a little pep in his step, you'd be like, wow, for a Florida guy, my man got a lot of Philly flavor. Dwight's family is from Philadelphia. Dwight, where's your family from in the city?
Well, shout out to my brother who lives out in Mount Airy.
Okay.
Shout out to my other family out in West Philly and Upper Darby. I was born at UPenn Hospital myself and lived in Philly for a few years. 60th and West Oak Lane, 58th and Pentridge. So shout out to my folks in those areas.
Now, Dwight, me and Dwight have been great collaborators over the last couple of years. We have great mutual friend, Elba Garcia, who helped make this happen. Dwight has a storied career in Florida organizing. He's a former school teacher, FAMU graduate, and was also in the Florida State Senate before becoming the political director for New Florida Majority. Dwight, again, with this conversation around sort of what's next for the progressive movement, in many ways, the electoral sort of ball got rolling here in Philadelphia with the election of Larry Castro in 2017 as district attorney, and then the progress we made even in certain defeats. I call it the Abrams-Gillum effect in this past election cycle. So, Dwight, from your perspective, sort of after this election cycle and this last couple of years of organizing, what do you feel is what's your takeaway of what we've learned and how we've progressed here in 2018?
Well, a lot of folks took those losses very, very seriously. If we're talking about Abrams and Gillum, of course, we definitely felt the brunt of it here in Florida. But what we saw in the analysis of the election was that the idea of being a pronounced progressive candidate moves you closer to victory than what has been the dominant thought process, which is you run this centrist person, this person that
the centrist white person.
Yeah, generally centrist older white person who can have this sort of quote unquote universal appeal and somehow draw from the other side instead of inspiring those non-voters or those folks that have chosen not to be engaged. And so in the case of Mayor Gillum in Florida and Leader Abrams in Georgia, what you saw was two candidates that 5, 6, 7 years ago would not have been a part of the conversation for statewide office in either one of those states push their agenda and get literally as close as you could conceivably be to winning victory. And in both the case of Mayor Gillum and Leader Abrams, you saw all the tricks in the book being pulled out to stop them in terms of voter disenfranchisement, in terms of literally having elections stolen from right under them. So folks need to understand that, A, they need to be mindful and be watching all the tricks of the trade that end up being implemented and used in the lead up to an election. That means purging of voter rolls. That means, people defunding supervisor of elections and using old machines and all the other tricks to try and stop you from electing the person or candidate that's really going to get it done.
What's very interesting about your organizing work, Dwight, with New Florida Majority, for people who are familiar with it, is that it very much is very proactive, not only about a progressive agenda, but a agenda about bringing African Americans, Latinos, and in the special case of Florida in particular, the Caribbean community, which is sort of the bridge for both groups, to come together to organize. So, Dwight, you had obviously a prominent African American on the top of the ticket in Florida. You had a lot of discussions around the Latino vote and its complexities in the state of Florida. What's your takeaway from the work you're doing, organizing not only Latinos and African Americans, but organizing them for a common agenda, which has its own unique challenges, but great opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. We know that. We understand, and this is something that we on the radio understand, but the larger community needs to understand that these communities are not monolithic, right? They are rich, they are deep, they are diverse, but more importantly, they're also individuals sort of going through the same woes and challenges of anyone else that's out there. And so in trying to strategize and mobilize those communities, you both have to understand the nuances, the cultural nuances of where folks are coming from, but also understand that when it boils down to it, when you get on those doors and you're having those one-on-one conversations, all these folks want is a better life for their children. All these folks want is to know that they, some level of economic security, and to know that the job that they work will pay the bills that they have, and they'll be able to, on some level, view this notion of success, which, it could be as simple as just being able to take a vacation as a family. So it's those kinds of things that are really moving folks. And what we saw this past cycle is the idea of speaking to people as human beings and understanding that they have a shared similar experience to that which you have. What we're finding oftentimes, though, and unfortunately it pans out over and over again, is that you have these sort of rich people on both sides of the aisle who are really kind of disconnected to the everyday experience of these folks. And although they have the money to run and the money to put out messages, they have a disconnect with the actual real life experience of these people. And so when you look at Abrams or Gillum or Beto O'Rourke the Arizona governor's race, or actually the successes that we saw in places like Wisconsin and Michigan, those people were able to connect with those everyday folks in their everyday experiences, and were able to articulate that properly.
Dwight, let's dig a little deeper on this, because you're talking about, think about Vanessa, and we got Vanessa Graver here, and I know she's an organizer herself, the challenges of organizing different types of people. So we got Dwight's organizing not only just within the Puerto Rican community in Florida for a second. He's got New Yorkers that don't even speak Spanish. He's got Puerto Ricans that have been there 10 years from the island that have different political affiliations. He's got people that came here post Maria, the hurricane. So you're dealing with politics not only in the United States, but from the island. You have a strong, somewhat more conservative leading evangelical Latino community down there. You got Venezuelans. You got the Cuban American dynamic, Dwight. So dig a little deeper in that, because it's not all. It sounds easy, but there's a lot of nuances there. So how are you dealing some of those challenges of all the different nuances, just even within the Puerto Rican community?
Oh, no doubt. Well, and what a lot of folks think around political organizing is that that organizations like ours are really kind of jumping on the bandwagon at that last minute. Sometime in June or July, we're getting out there and trying to mobilize these communities. The reality is that this is around the clock, deep dive work where you're trying to engage communities where they're at. And you named some of the diversity. When you think about the diversity in the Haitian community, which has a significant population here in Florida. You mentioned the Puerto Rican, kind of breakdown on who's there. You have a rich Colombian and Venezuelan and Honduran, Guatemalan following here, especially in the areas that we're working in, not to mention the diversity kind of within the Black diaspora of folks that are, have been here, folks that are transitioning, folks that are coming from the African continent. So, yeah, absolutely. When you think about it in those terms, it sounds daunting. But as I mentioned before, you know, it really, when I say finding the kind of cultural connection, is what you'll find is that those communities gravitates towards certain restaurants, for instance. You know, will listen to certain radio shows with, you know, with a greater level of enthusiasm, or be engaged, you know, in certain spaces with great regularity. So once you've kind of tapped into those spaces and been welcomed, or created an opportunity or pathway for your organization to get in there and be invited, then it really boils down to kind of that you know, that one-on-one connection. So, you know, the idea that myself as an African American, you know, born in Philly, but walk into a space with you know, Haitian American with a Haitian American community, and have a real time discussion about key issues, or you know, send one of our you know, organizers that speaks Creole to kind of articulate this notion of an ideology or methodology on how to become more economically prosperous, to engage in politics in a responsible way. That's how you get it done. But it definitely does not happen overnight, and it doesn't happen if you're one of those folks who likes to parachute in late in the summer, try to organize through November, and then magically disappear after the election's over. It can't be done that way, because there's always, in all those communities, one commonality is kind of a distrust of folks trying to come in and take advantage of those communities, to be opportunistic. And so our commitment is to be as responsible as we can about making sure we engage in those communities and stay engaged after the elections are over.
And you're listening to Dwight Bullard, the political director of the New Florida Majority, here on WPPM Community Radio, 106.5 FM in Philadelphia. And I'm here joined by the general manager of WPPM Radio, Vanessa Maria Graber. Vanessa, you're an organizer in your own right. What about Dwight's comments are you reflecting on as you think about the work you've done in radio and in community organizing?
Thanks for asking that question. Glad to have this conversation. Strategy is really important in you know, winning, right? We want to win. We want to, you know, wage a campaign that's effective. And when we win victories, I think that's the greatest motivator in terms of movement building and getting people on board. So now that we're post-election, this is a good time to kind of reflect and strategize for 2019 and think about what are the most effective ways we can build our movements and build leadership. I do drug policy reform, which attracts a very strange and eclectic group of people. Sometimes we don't share the same values, so it can be difficult to build coalitions, but you have to build coalitions. It's so important, being able to work with diverse groups and to be able to develop messaging that speaks to all of your needs. And because my background is in media and communications, I really try to think about the best ways we could message our demands, our campaign, and what our goals are. And so that requires spending a lot of time listening to people and finding out what motivates them, what their issues are. And then as a researcher, I identify the patterns. Okay, what are the things everybody is saying? Like here at PhillyCam, we are open to the public and we have a really diverse group of people, but every single person here wants access to the media and feels their voice isn't heard. So when we are fighting for things, we lead with that. What's the one thing that we all are on board with? We all want access to the media. We all want to be heard, and we feel as though our viewpoints aren't accurately represented. When it comes to drug policy reform, pretty much everybody wants freedom, personal freedom to, you know, not be in jail and be prosecuted for drug crimes, and to be able to consume without fear. And so there's a commonality in also not wanting to spend lots of money. People feel that resources are being wasted on mass incarceration, policing, and all of the fines and things associated with drug courts. And so again, it's like we might have different visions for the final product or the outcome, but essentially we all believe that something is wrong with the current legislation and we want change, and we all value our freedom and using resources more effectively. So again, it's like trying to find the commonalities, building bridges around that, And then the rest is like negotiating, right? Like, okay, everyone's not going to get what they want maybe out of this particular bill or campaign, but let's work to build power. Let's share resources. Let's build solidarity. So even though I might not agree with you 100%, I feel for your struggle. I recognize your struggle. And I support you in your goal to be more liberated, right? And so, again, it's like not getting hung up on all of the huge differences. I think the biggest challenge right now is like dealing with racism, even within our Latino and African-American communities. I think everybody internalizes that and experiences it differently. And within our communities, there's a lot of colorism. There's a lot of xenophobia. There's a lot of homophobia as well. And so in terms of building solidarity with immigrant peoples and LGBT peoples, there's a lot of work that really needs to be done. And we have to start in our own communities, educating people and making them understand that we're all being oppressed by the same systems of governance and the same corporations. And if we don't unite and show compassion and humanity towards other people who are with us in this struggle, we are going to lose. And so I feel like that's the best way to get a diverse group of people together, no matter what the issue is just try to find out what's one thing we could all fight for, that we all can believe in. And in terms of messaging, what can we all put on a sign or a T-shirt that we would all agree with? What's a hashtag we could all use? And then you just like build from there.
Well, speaking of needing to get wins, the new Florida majority was critical in a major victory in Florida to get Amendment 4 passed. Dwight, can you share with our audience what Amendment 4 was about and why that was? What was the key to building that coalition? Because it wasn't just you needed a majority; you needed over 60% of the voters to pass that very important amendment in Florida in November.
Absolutely. So Amendment 4, for us, for those who don't know, Florida was one of 3 states that had in its constitution a permanent disenfranchisement of former felons. So, if you committed a felony here in the state of Florida, you were barred from voting for the rest of your life, except for a process, a tumultuous process that to get through and get the governor to give you approval to get your rights back. So the initiative was, to your point, a coalition of a number of different partners and a lot of different organizations that said enough is enough, that we're going to commit our time, energy, and resources to make sure that these 1.4 million individuals have access to the ballot box. So in Florida, we require a 60% threshold in order to pass constitutional amendments. And so we were able to pass that with almost 65% of the vote. We were excited because, again, on January 8th, those 1.4 million people will be eligible to vote. But to my previous point, it did require year-round work. We were part of the coalition to collect petitions. We had to gather 800,000 petitions to get it on the ballot statewide. And that was a number of partners committed to getting out there every day and talking with everyday Floridians about saying yes to second chances and being responsible in how we do this, and acknowledging the fact that what put that law in place was nothing but Jim Crow racism, and what was keeping that law in place really was just an extension of that same Jim Crow racism. So, we committed to it. We built the coalition. It was across the aisle, Republican, Democrat, white, black, Latino, you name it. We're all kind of part of that.
Well,
Yes.
Dwight, can you talk about that? Because again, for you to get that ordinance, that amendment passed, you had to get some white support and some bipartisan support. So you talk about how, because oftentimes, this issue of felony enfranchisement is erroneously deemed just, basically a black issue, quote unquote. But you really got a pretty wide coalition together. So how did that happen? Because, quite honestly, I wonder sometimes, do we really have two different movements and we're not just sort of acknowledging it? We sort of have this diverse new generation of Americans coming up, primarily Black and Latino. And then we have sort of this, sort of suburban soccer mom progressive movement, which, has a lot of cool stickers on the back of their car. But sometimes there's a disconnect with sort of the direction we want to take our movement. So you developed quite a coalition there. What were some of the lessons that you can share with us on that?
Well, first off, you got to change the face. So if people are going to make the assumption or make the assertion that it's a predominantly black space, finding what we call returning citizens who are out there, who've been barred, who are white, who are Latino, who are successful. Oftentimes the notion is that these folks are former criminals and that they are living on the lowest rungs of society and they're going through all these challenges, when in reality there have been people who've been able to beat the system, become successful, and in spite of, but also letting people know that there is a diversity and richness of these folks, but that here's this person that you thought, was, a great car salesman or someone who, has been selling you real estate, come to find out that they've been permanently barred for vote. It's that aha moment, that epiphany moment that we were able to deliver to people consistently, and letting them understand that this movement was bigger than just this notion of what you believe a returning citizen to be. The reality is that it's maximized diversity, and so that leads in to helping to build that coalition. So that's really what makes it successful: humanizing people and letting people know that these are everyday people who are living right next door to you, who are in your own community, whose children go to the same school as yours do, and that they deserve the right and access to the ballot box. So that was key.
Yeah, and on some level, obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement brought this to the forefront. But I'm thinking, Vanessa, going back to the 2017 election, Larry Krasner for district attorney, this issue, and it's been on the forefront here locally for some since then, this issue of felony enfranchisement and sort of breaking this prison industrial complex that we have in this country, because it's so personal for so many of us, Vanessa, right? I mean, so many of us have a relative or a part of our family or someone from our community that family has just been literally broken apart because of sentences that were too long, and this frustration with our folks coming back home that are having such a struggle with just integrating back into society, finding a job, and being able to sort of have the life they used to have.
I think what we're doing now is really identifying the long-term effects of all of these really harsh sentencing guidelines that came as a result of the crime bill and drug prohibition and the immense amount of money, billions of dollars in the prison industrial complex that is being spent to incarcerate people. And now we know that we have the largest population of incarcerated peoples here in the United States. Philadelphia has the highest youth incarceration rate. What are the effects of these policies and how do they play out long term? Well, we're starting to see that now and identify that maybe these policies aren't having the outcomes that people intended when they put them into place. It's not really helping people rehabilitate, reintegrate into society. And the recidivism rate tends to be high when we put people in these prisons and we don't offer education, counseling, or support. We deny them access to communication and information so they can get support from their families. And then we continue to surveil, monitor, and oppress them as they are released on probation or parole. And so, again, I think can agree that there are problems with crime that we wish to solve, but is incarcerating people on a mass scale the way to do that? I think one of the things Larry Krasner is doing right now that's interesting is looking at the mandatory minimums for murder sentencing. And the tendency has been for prosecutors to always pursue the highest the highest felony to get the maximum sentence. And again, that's not really yielding the intended results and sending people away for life maybe isn't the best thing to do. So I think we're at this point where we're starting to reevaluate all of those things. And I think it takes a lot of education and unlearning, right? Because I think our tendency is like, lock them up if they've committed some type of crime, especially with like nonviolent drug offenses. Like, do people's lives really need to be ruined for 10, 20, 30 years? Afterwards, should people not be allowed to get loans to go to the university? Should they be barred from employment and housing opportunities? Should they be deported? Should they not be able to have custody of their children? These are all things that are implicated when people go through the criminal justice system. And this isn't even to mention all of the people who experience trauma being prosecuted for crimes and then they're never convicted or formally charged. We have tons of people who
that's not even including their children and their relatives that, again, lose contact with them. I
can speak to that quickly. You know, my father was in prison when I was a child growing up, and I witnessed the long-term effects of that 1-year sentence had on his ability to gain employment and be financially independent, which is why I took a particular interest in this subject. And I think it requires hearing these personal stories, as Dwight said, and humanizing people's experience, and really evaluating whether or not that's the best policy that we can come up with here in cities and states where we have tons of intelligent people thinking about this. I think we can do better. And I hope that we continue fighting mass incarceration and liberating people who've been oppressed by these policies.
And you listen to Vanessa Graber on the What's Next series here, WPPM Radio. We're talking about the future of the progressive movement, and we've been talking to not only Vanessa, of course, but Dwight Bullard, the political director of New Florida Majority, and we're actually very fortunate to have Dwight. You're still here with us. We'll keep you as long as we can have you, but we also have on the line. I wanted to introduce, having these two guests on. I want to think about Kevin Hart, Pink, Will Smith, all these Philadelphians that get poached by our world. And we have another person with deep Philadelphia roots on the line, the senior political strategist for Center for Popular Democracy, Natalia Salgado. Natalia, welcome to What's Next.
Thank you, Rafi. Thank you so much.
All right, Natalia and Dwight, we still have you, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, Dwight and Natalia, we've been talking to Dwight Bullard, your colleague at the New Florida Majority, who I'm sure you know and have collaborated with over the years. We're talking about sort of what's next for the progressive movement. Dwight's been giving us a summary of what's been happening in Florida, the lessons learned not only with maybe close losses electorally, but certainly big wins in organizing, and certainly a very big win with the passing of Amendment 4. Dwight, before we engage Natalia in this conversation, let us know what's next for you, what's next for your work in Florida, and anything else you'd like to share with our What's Next WPPM 106.5 listeners.
Well, of course, we're looking to register those 1.4 million individuals. That's the immediate next step, is expanding our democracy here in the state of Florida. The reality is that Mayor Gillum lost the race by less than 34,000 votes. In the case of our U.S. Senate candidate, lost the race by less than 13,000 votes. So we're really, really trying to dig in to that 1.4 million and not only get them registered, but get them, kind of up to speed on civic engagement, understanding, the political atmosphere, and hopefully ally with them on making big things happen. But we also welcome, our out-of-state partners. We've of course done great work with CPD, and always happy to welcome many of those folks down. They were helpful in both the primary and the general election in terms of actual resources and bodies on the ground. But to all my Philly fam out there, by all means, if the winter gets a little too cold, we welcome you down to sunny South Florida to help us really expand democracy. So that's the goal right now.
Dwight Bullard for the New Florida Majority. Thank you so much. Let us know where they can keep up with what you and New Florida Majority is doing on social media.
Absolutely. So you can @New FL Majority on Instagram as well as Twitter. That's @New FL Majority on Instagram and Twitter. And you can definitely check us out on our website, newfloridamajority.org. newfloridamajority.org. Again, that's newfloridamajority.org. And they can definitely check me out on social media at Dwight Bullard. Always trying to keep people engaged. Right now, we're trying to make sure that the unfortunate person who was elected governor does not view the election as any sort of mandate and understands that he has to govern for all people. And so one of the things we're doing is mobilizing up to our state capitol in Tallahassee on January 8th. So I encourage anybody who wants to join us in that. That's this mass mobilization to kind of let this new administration know that we are not going to go quietly.
Before we get back to the crew discussing the future of the progressive movement, a thought about the Trump legal novela. Que sabroso, que bochinche. The president's former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, pleaded guilty, got a deal, and was sentenced to 36 months in prison for lying to the feds about coordinating payoffs to Trump's mistresses to avoid those sordid details coming out during the presidential election. Two things. Sad lesson that I shared with my Facebook audience today. I'm going to bring it up for you right now, which was the first thought I had about the actual sentencing. Let me read you what I put on Facebook earlier to my personal Facebook page. Lesson of the day. If you spend a few decades committing crimes and bullying people, good idea to have an even sleazier boss to mitigate your sentence. Glad he is somewhat cooperating now with authorities, but shame white-collar criminals consistently get lighter sentences than poor people. Yes, indeed, it's bittersweet, the news. But the second part of this, the big picture here, and why congressional Democrats are in no hurry to call on impeachment. This is just the tip of the iceberg, my friends. If Cohen's only getting 3 years, Flynn's getting a few months, Manafort was talking, Inquirer cutting a deal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mueller knows everything. I mean, like everything, yo. Between the Russian electoral meddling, the coordination, treasonous actions, all this financial nonsense, it's all going to come out eventually. Payments to porn stars is going to feel like jaywalking tickets by the spring, my friends. I even believe in my heart they even have the goods on the new Attorney General Whitaker. Why do you think he's hiding his office? He ain't beating nothing. You ain't heard jack from my man. The novella has only begun. Last thing. It's interesting that Cohen squealed on the President of the United States like a pig, but he's willing to do some time because he wouldn't say one word about his other business associates, a sordid group of characters in the taxi business and sort of like the slumlord world of New York. You know, it reminds me of the first thing my friends told me when I moved to New York years ago. I remember they used to tell me, yo, Ray, whatever you do, dog, don't mess around in Brooklyn. Cohen selling the president a hot second ain't crossing no one in the BK, yo. Let's get back to our conversation on what's next for the progressive movement on Ray's Talk Show. Philly, keep on making it. The rest of the world keeps on taking it, and that's the case for Dwight and Natalia Salgado. Natalia, welcome to the What's Next special series here on WPPM Radio. You're a Philly transplant doing big things on a national level. Tell us a little bit about your new role at Center for Popular Democracy.
Sure. Thank you, Rafael, for having me, and excuse the echoes, the quietest place I could find in my office to be able to participate on the call. So a lot of things, right? I think that we're looking towards 2020. One of the things that both of your other callers highlighted was, we're done the midterm elections, but we're not done, not even a little bit, right? Like, we have to sort of figure out how to build infrastructure while we head into 2020. I think that what we saw in Georgia and Florida is that when you build a deep infrastructure, when you build deep relationships, deep ties with the community, then you're able to turn them out during election time. But that doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen in one election cycle. So I think that we're sort of reframing our organizing model and really thinking about how are we talking to folks in a way that's deeper and more relevant to their lives. So part of my job here is going to be to think through that framework and work with 53 of our affiliates across the country to figure out how to do exactly that as we prepare for 2020.
You know, I when I think about you, Vanessa, and I think about Natalia, and I think about our dozens and hundreds of, and really thousands, but just in terms of the people that I know, there's so many Natalia and Vanessas out there that I engage with. I'm lucky enough to collaborate with on this work because, and I think about the sort of AOC effect with our Congresswoman-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Part of her appeal, and I think part of the reason that her presence on the scene has really resonated with so many people, is that she really is a, I want to say, lack of a better term, symbol of you all, and what really is the what is not just the future but the present for our community, really our country organizing, a very woman-dominant organizing network, very diverse, particularly with African-American and Latina women leading the charge. And so y'all were already doing the work. Now we finally have a few people of this generation that have these formal roles and are getting a little more attention. And I think that's quite honestly what's upsetting the apple cart, not only in sort of conservative media, which she's become a big target of, but really within the more democratic world. You know, a lot of pushback on her presence. I don't know if you all saw the former Obama staffer Cecilia Munoz sort of clapback at her on Twitter for her sitting in at Pelosi's office. And we could talk about that specific incident. But the bottom line is that, Natalia, this is an opportunity and this is a moment when this generation of leadership has to be given more platform. But quite honestly, y'all are have decided you have to, create that space for yourselves, which I think is a good thing.
No, I completely agree. Listen, I think that we're at a point in time in history where the normal sort of democratic institutions, those who are part of the sort of old school way of doing things, are being asked to sort of sit up and pay attention. And I think AOC has really sort of tapped into that. And she's done so in a very sort of savvy way. She knows what the young folks want to hear. She knows how they want to hear it. She knows that the sort of behind the doors, the backroom negotiating is no longer going to cut it. People want to have more transparency and accountability in their government officials, in the folks who are leading this country, and she's giving them that. And I think that for all of us, and myself included, quite frankly, that are part of the sort of old tradition or come out of that tradition, it's time for us to sort of sit up and notice and take heed of the messages that are being thrown our way by emerging leaders like her.
I'm going to take a different approach because I'm not a super fan. And I know that's it might be surprising, but the reason I'm skeptical of people like her and Bernie Sanders is because people have been proposing these strategies and speaking these talking points for a very long time now, especially at the height of the Occupy movement. And we saw movements like the Bernie Sanders campaign co-opt a lot of that language without giving credit, and then bringing organizers from Black Lives Matter onto his campaign. And then you could see how some of his platform issues started to evolve into something that would more accurately reflect how those communities were feeling. And she recently was on a panel the other day with Bernie Sanders about environmental movement and climate change. And she said she first got inspired at Standing Rock. And I thought, well, that's not that long ago. You really haven't put in that much work. And again, the reason why I'm skeptical is because there's so many people, especially here in Philadelphia, that really have been organizing and movement building for many, many years. People that are the same age as her that have 10, 15 years more of that work. I think, to kind of bring it all together, it's really about accountability. I'm glad these progressive leaders are going to be in office and they're going to be changing the face of the House and the Senate and the Democratic Party. But I'm, as a journalist, right, and member of the media, I'm ready to hold them accountable, and I'm going to be scrutinizing everything that they're saying and lining that up to the actions that they take legislatively and sponsoring bills and how they vote and who they're taking money from. And I just am so jaded because so many people that I admired have then disappointed me later on. Like I just read that Beto O'Rourke it takes the second highest amount of contributions from the oil and gas companies, right behind Ted Cruz.
And did you see the expose that, like, he basically did nothing in his 20s? Like, he basically just was in a rock band and, so, yeah, there's definitely some stuff to scrutinize. Natalia, on that point, Vanessa brings up a really good point. And on that point, Natalia, you have a lot of experience sort of organizing in like a blue democratic environment, right? In the work you've done in New York and Philadelphia and urban sort of more democratic areas. So what are your thoughts about how we hold our friends who are Democrats or progressives or ultra progressives accountable in this environment?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, talk is cheap, right? Like, and politicians are really good.
And social media can be cheap.
Yeah, and people are propelled.
It's interesting. I don't completely Vanessa, I don't disagree with a lot of the points you're making. I think that there's sort of the dual effect, right? Like I think there's what you're saying doesn't take away from the fact that it's important for people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to be speaking about these issues. I found that, and when Vanessa was speaking, it brought me back to another point, sort of post-Trump, the rise of all these sort of indivisible groups, right? And they were popping up all over the place. And there was points where I remember being frustrated because I have been doing organizing in the labor movement for I don't know how long, and organizing in political circles. And I remember thinking, we're already doing this. We're doing this. Like, you guys should just be a part of the stuff that we're doing. But you know what?
I'm laughing because this is how old I am. This is how I felt in 2008 with the Obama people.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
that's how I felt
organizing just began in 2000.
But there's a part of me that's a little bit like, we're in the fight for our lives, right? In a way that we weren't necessarily in 2008. We are in a fight for our lives. And so there's a little bit of, let's throw it all up against the wall and let's see what sticks. So yes, I feel sort of frustrated that there are some folks that are coming out, and we've been doing this for God knows how long. And we have seen the people who are in the trenches, fighting, getting their names out there, being trolled, getting death threats, all that sort of stuff. They have paid their dues. But I, quite frankly, have no problem with other folks now, after sort of moving through all of that. I welcome other folks coming into the space and not necessarily claiming, to Vanessa's point, sort of claiming the work. But I do welcome the sort of fresh energy coming into this and figuring out how we're going to work together. And it's going to be messy, and it's going to be hard. And I have some of those cynical feelings as well after doing this for a while. But we have to figure out how to bring in these new cohorts into the fold. And quite frankly, we never, ever can stop holding people accountable. We can never stop holding elected officials accountable. They are human at the end of the day. They are fallible. I very much reject the idea of elected officials as sort of like this prophetic figures. They are not your messiahs. They're not going to save us. We can only save ourselves. And this is why we work so hard to build movements, because movements are the things that we can believe in. And as much as those elected officials can sort of uphold the principles of the movements that we're building, then I'm on board.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's important just to have somebody like Alexandria like on these panels right now. And I think more importantly, I think she's one of the few people like Bernie Sanders who can hold the Democratic Party accountable, right? Because the Democratic National Conference was here in Philadelphia, and I was covering a lot of the protests, and there are huge divisions between like the Bernie Sanders camp and the I'm still with her camp. And I found it very interesting being an observer that it didn't seem like they were in the same party, And I also think that Bernie had this ability to attract a lot of people that have traditionally aligned with third parties, right? Bringing them and then bringing younger people who had never been activated at all. And so they're not going anywhere, right? They're here, they're active, they're woke now, right? So the party is going to have to figure out how to engage these voters and how to get them on their platform. And we need to do that before 2020. I should say they need to do that. They need to figure out how to deal with this new population that these two figures have galvanized. And I suspect that they won't be the last two, that there's going to be more emerging leaders that are also going to have this effect, and that these people are going to demand a shift in policies that are too centrist and too corporatist for the Democratic Party.
Well, and Natalia, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts on this, because we are hitting on the big issue here on the What's Next series on WPPM Radio. We're exploring what's next for the progressive movement on this episode. And we have Natalia Salgado from the Center for Popular Democracy, a native Philadelphia, and also a shout out to my Colombianas out there. The South American women are taking over the world. They just haven't sent us the memo yet. But Natalia, I don't want to say my fear, but when Obama got elected in 2008, and it's actually coming to fruition at this point, is I wondered, will we really have, and thinking about Bush HW being buried today, will we ever have another sort of standard politician be president again? Or will we have, not to say Obama he was a senator, but he really won as much on being a political celebrity. And of course, now we have the extreme example of that in the White House now. But, just thinking about Beto, and look, I went to college with the guy. I was so excited. I flew people to Texas to endorse him. But at the same time, he's not really qualified to be president of the United States. I mean, I love the guy. But how do we, Natalia, how do we keep substance in this movement? Because rhetoric and celebrity and social media is such a dominant part of what sort of what people are consuming right now. And, there's policies to be passed. There's local ordinances. There's movement building. And so how do we keep the sort of meaty part of what we have to do in top of mind for folks, many of which are newer to the process?
Yeah, no, I think that, it goes back to sort of my original point, right? Like we have to sort of, looking at 2020, we're not going to be able to win these races during one election cycle. We're not going to be able to move our communities during one election cycle. That's just not how it works. Our communities are rejecting this sort of transactional politics. I even use myself as an example, helicoptering into other spaces and not really looking to do something long-term and build long-term infrastructure in those communities. So I think what we need to do is really build a solid base of what our principles are we willing to stand on. And those principles are going to be the meat of our work. Those principles are going to be the substance of our work. And when those are sort of the principles by which we're running our movements and by which we are building infrastructure, the candidates are then forced to have to interact with us in that way. They're forced to have to be more than just a good speech giver. They're forced to have to say, yes, I'm for a higher minimum wage, right? Yes, I'm for Medicare for all. And they're forced to have to be held accountable and really sort of sign on to those principles if they want our support as we head into the 2020 presidential.
Natalia, we're going to have in Philadelphia some local elections coming up, and we'll see if the Mayor Kenny gets a serious challenge. We'll have a lot of city council races and other elections coming up. You've done a lot of city-based work. So what are your thoughts around, for our folks listening here specifically in Philadelphia and this region, around how should we take advantage of this opportunity to build movement, continue to organize, and bring up the issues we care about? Because, with my day work, we did a pretty significant independent expenditure canvas operation in Philadelphia this past cycle, and very, the local neighborhood issues were the dominant factor. Opioids in Kensington, gentrification, a little further in Fairhill, housing in Juniata, issues that are very sort of based on what city government and what city officials should be doing, addressing. So what are your thoughts around how we continue to put this progressive agenda on a municipal electoral level?
Yeah, so I think that, once again, this sort of hashing out what the meat is, but I also think we got to think about the people that we're asking to run for office, and how are we sort of creating a pipeline so that community leaders, the Black captain who wants to be more civically engaged, but doesn't have yet the sort of sophistication or maybe just the sheer knowledge of what it takes to run for office. How are we sort of creating a pipeline for candidates to embody the things that we care about, to get to a place where they can formally run for office? And I think we need to be creative of who those people are, and that they may not resemble what we traditionally consider to be, or even what the Democratic Party traditionally considers to be elected officials. And so there's a certain amount of open-mindedness, right? Maria de la Bodega on the corner may not always have been seen as someone who would be able to run for office, but I think this is a different time, and I think we need to be open to being able to welcome different people into that process.
And it's interesting you talk about that, because so many of particularly women of color seized that opportunity this last electoral cycle with the elections in the House of Representatives. There's this iconic photo, black and white, of about 8 women of color who just got elected in the House. AOC is a part of it, and Ayanna Pressley and some others. And so on the city level, it's even less votes you need. So there's even more opportunity. But of course, it takes more work to get people focused on those issues. Vanessa, what are your thoughts about what you're taking out of this conversation as it relates to kind of these city elections that are coming up in Philadelphia next year?
I mean,
go ahead, Vanessa.
I was just going to say,
no, go ahead.
I'm interested in hearing people's specific proposals to address these issues. I don't think it's enough to say, we have a problem with the opioid crisis and we need to do something about it. No, what exactly are you going to do? Because bulldozing the encampments is not working. How are you going to specifically address this? And that's what as a journalist, that's what I'm going to really press candidates to say. It's we want to see your plan. Do you actually have a plan? Is it posted somewhere? Let's look at those points. Because right now we can't talk broadly anymore. We're in a moment of crisis and a lot of issues here in Philadelphia, and we need specific outcomes to be achieved. And when you're applying for a grant, you got to really list your your whole plan. You have to have a timeline, your objectives, your staff. And I want to press candidates to stop speaking in generalities, give specific proposals, because people organizing on the ground actually have specific proposals, and is what you're proposing aligned with what the community thinks is best. And I think that's going to be the best determinant in terms of the connections that these emerging leaders have to the communities that they claim that they're going to serve. And
to that, and I'll get to you in a second, Natalia, but to that, one of the things that I think, and there's a racial justice component to this, is that, there's going to be a segment of activists that have this energy that if it's not the most ultra-progressive plan, they're not going to want to hear it. Whereas that's necessarily where our community's at. Our community just wants to get it done. They're not so much concerned with it being an ideological pure solution. And even as activists, we have to sort of balance that. So, Natalia, what are your thoughts on this part of the conversation?
Yeah, so, my sense is I agree with Vanessa on the sort of question of sound bites. I mean, it's the time of generalities are over. We have seen that a lot of our government has been based on a formality of sorts. And so we need to be able to press our folks around the details of the plan and what that means. And so I completely agree with that. I also think that as we, represent our respective community organizations, we also have some work to do. We eat, breathe this stuff day in and day out. We have a responsibility to the people that we represent to really go on that granular level with them as well. Right? We don't necessarily need everybody to be a policy wonk, but we do need our folks to have a basic understanding of different sort of policy platforms and which ones are problematic, and also to be able to assess out what are the things that are a problem. That sounds like a great plan, but this is also, they don't have a portion of this plan dedicated to figuring out how to have union workers this sounds like a great plan, but they're not going to be able to safeguard workers' wages. So I think that we also have a responsibility to not just be the only ones in an organization or part of the movement that have this sort of intellectual understanding of policy, but that our folks on the ground also do as well.
Well, our new members of Congress are not the only ones that are now stepping onto the national stage. Natalia, this new role for you, this is a national role for you, and I'm really excited that you're now the senior political strategist for Center for Popular Democracy. Natalia's had many sort of local and regional roles in New York and Philadelphia with labor unions and and local governments. Natalia, what's next for you, and what's next for Center for Popular Democracy we should be keeping an eye on, looking to support in 2019?
Yeah, so I think that what's next is a sort of an all-encompassing of all the commentary that I made earlier. I think we're really looking to build the infrastructure in 2019 to gear up for 2020. We need to be able to get out there once again and talking to our folks. And to the point that Vanessa made earlier, there's a question of accountability. And we need to make sure that these new members of Congress are hearing from us frequently, and that they're not speaking in sound bites, and that they are speaking in using the right sort of policy platforms to move forward their issues. And so there's a lot of building and getting ready for 2020. But I think that for me personally, one of the things that I'm most excited about is being able to go out into the states and sit down with some of the folks who are doing some of the amazing work. You have TOP in Texas, and you have Lucha in Arizona, and then you have New Florida Majority in Miami. And I'm really excited to really get the sort of best practices about what it means to organize in our communities.
Finally tonight, the 2020 Watch. Indeed, the first official candidate has stepped into the arena, and it's none other than former HUD Secretary and Mayor of San Antonio, Texas, Julian Castro. Castro shared on Facebook today the moment he signed the paperwork to open his Presidential Exploratory Committee, along with his wife, Erica. She was actually on her lunch break. The whole thing was like really cute. And even nice effect, they had the Virgen Guadalupe painting in the background. Really nice. Very, very nice. He noted on the video how he had to complete the form on paper because the online portal did not allow him to add the accent on the A in Julian. Very nice. Castro is an aspirational figure to many of us, looking for more diversity amongst national political leadership. And he has a real distinct personal story along with his identical brother, Congressman Joaquin Castro, who I recently spent some time with in San Antonio, and his mother, one of my favorite people in Latino politics, legendary San Antonio community activist, Rosie Castro. Castro has a lot to prove to become a serious contender, I must say. Can he raise the initial money to be competitive? We're probably talking, in total, you're going to have to raise, upwards of $100 million to be a serious player in this one. Does he have a message that will separate him from the crowd, make people overlook his youth and his resume that, in a previous times, until very recently, would have seemed very thin for a presidential candidate? But the good news is he has time to make his case. I think it was a really good move for him strategically to come out early before the geyser of candidates gushes out in early 2019. We're going to continue to follow all the candidates. And pero de corazón, mucho suerte, papá. Thanks for listening to this edition of Ray's Talk Show. Again, please give us a review on iTunes or wherever you consume your podcast. Continue to support our movement here, not only as a podcast, but on our radio show, the What's Next series on WPPM 106.5 FM. And let us know what you think about Ray's Talk Show. Hit us up on social media and let us know what's next, familia. Have a great week.